So Apple had a launch event yesterday for two devices, the iPhone 5S and the iPhone 5C. So what I'll do is I'll talk about specs and we'll go through the motions and my thoughts of it. And I also have 500 mils of tea to get me through this whole thing. So Apple released a brand new, I say brand new device, a new device called the iPhone 5C. And basically it's a new phone, what they're calling it, a new phone. It's got 5 colours: white, pink, yellow, blue and green, and it also comes with several cases that kind of match up with the colours of the iPhone 5C as well. There's the A6 chip, which we saw in the iPhone 5. 8 megapixel rear facing camera, 1.2 megapixel front facing camera, a 4-inch Retina display, so that's 1136 by 640 pixel resolution at 326 ppi, pixels per inch. It's got 10 hours of browsing, 10 hours of talk, 10 hours of video playback. And then there was the iPhone 5S, which is new, 7.6 millimeters thick, 112 grams. New cases, like with the iPhone 5C, there's going to be some new cases specifically designed for the iPhone 5S. The A7 chip, which is 2 times faster than the previous. It's also got a 64-bit addressing, which is really quite cool. We'll go on to that in a minute. OpenGL ES 3.0 as well for gaming, that sort of stuff. New M7 chip. Now this is quite interesting. Basically, it offloads any motion, so accelerometer, gyroscope, compass, all that data, as opposed to going to the A7 chip. It offloads it from the CPU into the GPU into the M7, which is kind of like a motion chip, which obviously saves battery life for a start, and B means you don't then have to use the A7 to be dealing with the with all the the gyroscope and the motion stuff. It's also getting a 15% larger camera sensor, f-stop 2.2 if that really interests you, 10 frames a second still to photos. You can take 10 photos within a second, which is quite cool. 120 frames a second slow-mo in 720p. That's really cool. I shall come on to that in a minute. 3 times zoom in 1080p capture, like with the iPhone 5C. True Tone Flash, again I should go on to. Touch ID, which is basically fingerprint recognition via the home button. I'll go on to that as well. And that's pretty much it. I'm not going to go into pricing but for a minute. I'm just going to go into the actual whole thing, my thoughts of it, what's going on. So, you're going to be very, very surprised about what I'm going to say about Apple and everything else. Because what I usually do is I usually slag Apple off. But in this case, I'm not so much. In actual fact, probably I'm going to get a lot of hate for this, but I don't care. I think actually Apple have now suddenly turned around and now are starting to innovate again. The iPhone 5C is interesting. Basically, it's not cheap, which is kind of what a lot of people were thinking it was going to be. I mean, it's cheaper, but it's not cheap. Basically, it's iPhone 5 specs, and it's going to cost 469 quid. That's the standard base model. That's from 469 quid off contract. Now, that isn't that great, but let's say it's iPhone 5 spec, so it's the old spec. Pretty much a new case. It looks quite funky. Johnny Ive is actually calling it unapologetically plastic. And they did some bullshit like things to do with the like the manufacturing processes, which you don't really give a shit about. But yeah, I mean basically the iPhone 5C, it's coloured, and that's kind of it, I suppose. I mean, there's nothing really you'd say, well, that's fantastic, that's well, because there isn't. Obviously iOS 7 will come with that. But the iPhone 5S is pretty interesting and pretty cool, and actually it might push some things towards smartphones now, which is quite good, because I mean Apple haven't really innovated for pretty much just since Steve Jobs stepped down as CEO. They haven't really done anything innovative. The Mac Pro, kind of pointless, not necessary. iPhone 5, pretty pointless, not really, it's not really competing with the rest of the market. What else did they release? Most things they released, to be honest. The iPad Mini, not very competitive with the market. All these things they released haven't been very competitive. But the iPhone 5S could be the thing that then brings Apple back from their we're not going to innovate anymore, we're just going to copy the market. The A7 chip is very interesting. Now, when I actually heard about the A7 chip, it being 64-bit, I sort of turned around and said, why would you bother with that? Because currently as smartphones go in its current form, there's no need to go any more than 64-bit because, or 32-bit, because you don't really need any more than 3 gigs of RAM to be addressed. That's the difference between 32-bit addressing and 64-bit addressing. 32-bit addressing, you can address up to 4 gigs RAM, but it's not quite 4 gigs RAM. It's slightly less than that. Usually it's something like about 3.5, something like that Windows can actually address. 64-bit addressing has a theoretical maximum of a couple of terabyte, 128 terabytes, something stupid, I think, in terms of RAM. It's stupidly high anyway. There's as things stand today, I mean, you're probably going to be like 5 years down the line, or even the rest down the line, before we even get anywhere near to the theoretical maximums of 64-bit addressing. So it I mean, it's interesting. It's kind of good they're doing that, because it means that it's going to push the market forwards. But really, putting 64-bit addressing on a system on a chip, I mean, like a system on a chip that's small and is low on power, is it such a good idea? I don't know. It's interesting, but I don't necessarily know whether or not it's needed. I mean, it's quite interesting that the iOS 7 will now support 32-bit apps and 64-bit apps, but really, what's the point of even supporting 32-bit apps? If you're going to go 64, you might as well just say, right, everybody has to do 64 and everybody has to rewrite the code, which usually is what everybody has to do anyway when a new version of iOS comes around or there's any update. Now, the other interesting thing is the M7 chip. Now, Apple haven't really gone into too much detail. I mean, they're calling it a chip within its own right, and I mean, I'm probably thinking it's not a chip in its own right. It's part of the system-on-a-chip design of the A7, and it's just an extra bit within the A7 architecture that allows it to offload things to a separate CPU or set of transistors that can do a lot of the processing that the CPU would otherwise do. And this is quite an interesting concept, and it basically what it will do is it will offload things like accelerometer, gyroscope, and compass data, GPS, that sort of stuff, to as opposed to it going to the A7, it will go into the M7, which will then mean it will use less power, because the A7's not having to crunch the numbers, so that the CPU and the GPU aren't having to crunch the numbers, and it also means that when you're playing games and stuff like that, you can use motion will go to a different chip, so you won't see considerable lag. It's not lag, I know, it's like reduced frames or whatever, because lag's an internet term. But anyway, so that's it's quite interesting, and I have to say I'm quite impressed. Across the board, I'm quite impressed anyway. Which people are going to be like, "What the hell? What are you high, Aaron?" No, I'm not high. I'm genuinely am impressed with what Apple have done. Does it mean I'll go out and buy one? Probably not. But hey, there you go. The other thing they started banning about was the 15% larger camera sensor. Which, I mean, HTC were banging on about this. But, I mean, they're claiming it's like better images. The only thing you get with the bigger sensor is essentially better low light quality. That's kind of the difference between a smaller sensor and a bigger sensor. You get better low light quality, and you do actually get a better image as a result. They're basically saying that the pixels are bigger. I mean, it's not. Basically, the thing is that CCDs, the image sensor, is getting to the stage now where pixels on the sensor are pretty much the same as pixels, or the same size as photons in real life. So we're almost there at the point where really image sensors are going to be as good as they can ever be, without they're going to be as they can capture photons of light, and that's the smallest they can go, and that's kind of where we almost are at the moment, and it's quite interesting. I mean, if you know anything about physics and how image sensors work and stuff like that, it's quite interesting. And I think DSLRs are pretty much there now, and it'll maybe take a couple of years before they actually are there, and then it'll port over to things like smartphones. And saying generally smartphone cameras aren't that great. I mean, they always are. I mean, they're alright. In terms of megapixels, they finally got rid of the megapixel race within the smartphone market, which they did before. And now concentrating on things like lenses and other stuff like that, which is really quite cool. And they've got a bigger f-stop value, so it means more light can enter the sensor, which is quite good. Again, 10 photos a second is quite cool. So you can take 10 frames a second, so you can take 10 photos within a second. That's quite good and quite cool, really, as a for a smartphone, because a lot of smartphones you can take quite a bit, but it's just the software generally lets it down, because the actual sensor and the shutter are pretty much, there's no real discernible frame lag with that, or reduced frames per second with that. It's usually the software that lets it down, so that's kind of quite interesting. The other thing which is really quite cool, 120 frames a second video recording, which allows you to slow-mo things up to a quarter of the speed, which is really quite cool. This is only in 720p, but you can't expect the Earth from because I suspect the image sensor will probably overheat, and probably the A7 can't cope with the amount of data that it's been chucked at. So that's quite an interesting thing, and is it a feature you kind of want to use? I don't know. It'd be interesting for things like Vine, and it'll be interesting for things like Instagram, because it then means you don't then have to edit things, get a decent quality camera that can record at 120 frames a second and then reduce the speed. So that's it's quite an interesting concept, and it's quite cool, and hopefully that'll then come through to the rest of the smartphone market, and that'll be really great for the rest of us. 3x zoom during 1080p capture. This is something that's quite good, because with most things, with most cameras nowadays, it can record 1080p no problem at all. In actual fact, it can probably record 4K no problem. But because you've got this huge sensor size, and 1080p is quite a small area of that sensor. So with things like, my Canon 600D can do it, because the sensor in that is huge, and it's probably taking up maybe, I could probably do like 4 1080p things all side by side on that sensor, and I can do 3 times. Do 3 times digital zoom without degradation on this. And that's 1080p, and that's quite cool. So that's one of the things that's coming into the new iPhone, which is quite interesting, and hopefully again that will then port over to everything else. Because it's got an 8 megapixel sensor, which is far more than you need because you really only need something like a 2 megapixel sensor to pick up 1080p. HD stuff. It's not, in terms of actual, it's not that much. Like 1080p, although when you see it on your nice big huge screen TV, it looks great. 1080p isn't actually that high resolution. And if you work in IT or you've got a decent enough monitor, you know what I'm talking about. You can get a 256 by whatever it is, 2560 by something else. I can't remember the resolution. Anyway, the other thing is True Tone Flash. Now, I don't really know how. It's not really true tone. Basically what it does is it detects what light's in the room and then automatically adjusts the flash accordingly. On a tiny flash like that, it's not really true tone. It's not going to be the best light, because smartphone LEDs aren't going to be that great. So it's not necessarily going to be true tone in that it's going to be the best quality you can. If you add studio lights. But I suppose Apple are trying as hard as they can with a shitty little LED light. I don't think that's really going to make that much difference. Now the last thing to cover is Touch ID. Touch ID basically replaces the home button with, I think it's still going to be a physical button, but it's going to put a fingerprint scanner on the home button of the iPhone. Now this basically is going to replace things like PIN and store purchases and things like that. So it will use your fingerprint to do in-store purchases, in-app purchases, and to unlock your phone and things like that. Which is it's quite an interesting concept. But the only other thing to cover is that it's made out of laser cut sapphire crystal to pick up fingerprints better. So Apple have turned around and said, because a lot of people were saying, oh no, what about fingerprint data? That's quite sensitive information. What's happening with it? Apple is saying it's never going to be stored on Apple servers, and it's not backed up to iCloud. So that's a downside in that you can't then just, when you get a new phone, press your fingerprint to it, it recognises who you are and this is absolutely your phone for you. But it's good for security. Basically what's going to happen is it's going to store it on the security chip on the A7. So there's as part of the A7 architecture, there's going to be a security element of it, and it will store things encrypted on that. So it's not going to call home, it's not going to send any of that data around and about, which is really quite good. And yeah, basically, Apple, the official statement is Touch ID's fingerprint info is encrypted and stored securely in the secure enclave inside the A7 chip. So that's kind of quite reassuring. A lot of people on Twitter were going on about the NSA wanting access to that data. Apple is one of the many companies that decides it wants to give data to the NSA. So, although they're working around that, I'll go on to that in a minute. So, I don't know whether or not you necessarily want to use your fingerprint with an Apple device, because it has the potential for the NSA to grab hold of it. I mean, if Apple had basically turned around and saying, well, it's only stored locally and there's no way, no how you can get access to it unless you have physical access to the phone, then fair enough. I mean, that's not too bad. But if down the line they then say, well, we're going to embed it with iCloud and all this other stuff, I would be very wary about using fingerprints to unlock stuff. Fingerprints to unlock stuff is really quite cool. I mean, I do it for laptops and stuff like that I own, but it's not calling anywhere. It's only local to the machine, and because you've got TPM, it doesn't really matter if someone nicks the device anyway. So there is that. And saying the only other thing to mention about the Apple thing, they're basically anonymizing data now. There's a lot of things that after Facebook started doing it, Google are now doing it, Apple are now doing it. Basically, with a lot of the backlash that the NSA having access to all these servers, obviously it's not very good PR for everybody. So what they're now doing is anonymizing data, so that basically even if the NSA rock around with a warrant and say, we want to get access to this, Apple can turn around and say, well, we can't even get access to it because it's stored in a random order. There's no way, no how have you ever been able to recover it, unless you're the actual user with the username and password. So that's kind of, it's quite an interesting thing. The only other thing to end on is the iPhone 5S will be 549 quid. Say not cheap. Neither of the things that were released are cheap, but I think it's very, very interesting. I won't be going out and buying one because I just won't. There's not a really great incentive for me to go out and buy one. However, I am very impressed with what Apple have produced, which is, I know people are going to be shocked and amazed that I've said that, but I really genuinely am. I think Apple have produced, I've actually started innovating again, and this is fantastic. Obviously, embed that with iOS 7. iOS 7 will be released on the 18th of September as well, so next week, is it? Yeah, next week, yeah. So that's pretty cool. So iOS 7 will be coming to Apple devices. I'll be getting into my iPad and testing it out and seeing what it's actually like. I didn't bother with the developer preview because I was like, well, there's no point. I don't use Apple devices that much to worry about it. So yeah, that's pretty much it. That's pretty much my take on the whole Apple event. You can watch, I'll put some links in the description below of all the information you need regarding iPhone, the iPhone 5S, the iPhone 5C and all that other stuff, and when you can watch the keynote. And apart from that, I shall catch you in a later video.